After the funeral, the world didn't end. That's what surprised Ruth the most. The sun still rose, bleeding gold across the horizon like nothing had changed. The wind still carried the scent of the field, soft with late spring and soil and the distant promise of corn. Birds still sang, but the silence inside her was louder than any storm she had ever weathered. And the house, once filled with life, now echoed like a tomb. She had buried Nathaniel with her own hands, not because there weren't people willing to help, but because she couldn't bear anyone else touching what used to be hers. She placed him beside the barn, beneath the tree he always said he'd hang a swing on once the baby learned to walk. But the swing never came, and the baby never walked. Ruth buried her too, a few feet away, swaddled in the same quilt Ruth had stitched with shaking fingers and foolish hope during those long, breathless months. Now the house was too big, the bed too cold, the sky too wide. In the first few days, Ruth moved like a ghost in her own home, sweeping floors that never got dirty, boiling water she never drank, folding clothes that no one would wear. The silence was unbearable, but she couldn't stand the sound of her own voice either. So she stopped talking. There was no one to hear her. Anyway, her hands knew the rhythm of the days, even when her heart didn't. Feed the hens, patch the fence, boil beans, carry wood, do it again, and again, as if routine could resurrect the dead. She didn't cry, not once, but she would wake in the middle of the night gasping for breath, clutching the pillow where Nathaniel's head used to rest, as if some part of her refused to believe he was truly gone, as if his scent might still be caught in the seams. Sometimes, she'd open the chest under the bed just to run her fingers over the tiny clothes she had folded months ago. Soft little shirts, knit socks, the yellow bonnet she'd made from an old curtain. Everything smelled faintly of cedar and endings. Grief, she discovered, was not loud. It didn't scream or sob. It crept. It settled into the cracks of her life and whispered things when she wasn't looking. It turned the creak of the floorboards into footsteps that weren't there. It made the wind sound like a voice. It made the ache in her chest feel like breathing had turned into a chore. And then, one morning, he appeared. A dog, just there, curled up under the porch rail like he'd always belonged. He didn't bark, didn't whine, just lay flat, his ribs rising and falling slowly, eyes half-lidded, watching. Ruth saw him through the window while stirring beans. She considered chasing him off. Strays came through from time to time, always looking for scraps, but something about him stopped her. He wasn't begging, he wasn't even trying to come closer. He was just there. Like the wind, like the sky, like grief. She left a bowl of food out that night. She told herself it was pity. Maybe it was. Maybe she was just tired of feeling invisible. But he didn't eat. He didn't even sniff the bowl. Just watched her place it, then curled tighter into the wood slats. The next morning, the bowl was empty, moved slightly. Ruth pretended not to notice. She had fences to check, chickens to feed, wood to stack. But by noon, she found herself glancing at the porch more than once, looking for a flick of a tail, a glint of an eye. And every time, he was there, still, silent, present. He didn't try to win her over. He didn't need to. Ruth wasn't looking for companionship. She wasn't looking for anything. But loneliness is a hungry thing. And his stillness made space for something she hadn't felt in weeks: acknowledgement. He saw her, just saw her. By the third day, she stepped over him on her way to the well, and he shifted just slightly, enough for his flank to brush against her skirt. The contact was brief, but it cracked something open in her chest. She walked inside, opened the trunk under the bed, and stared at the quilt with the stars she'd once stitched with love. She didn't cry, but she held the fabric longer than she meant to. Each day after that, the dog stayed, quiet as grief, constant as breath. She never gave him a name, but she spoke to him once, just to hear her voice again. Just one word, "Still here?" And his ears twitched. Yes, she thought, still here. She stopped pretending he wasn't part of the house, started checking the porch step before opening the door, not to avoid stepping on him, but to make sure he was still there. She didn't call it comfort. She didn't dare, but the silence felt less cruel with him in it. There were moments, quiet, aching moments, when Ruth would sit on the rocking chair by the fire, hands wrapped around her own elbows. And remember the sound of her husband's laugh, the weight of the child that never cried. And her chest would tighten so sharply it felt like breaking. In those moments, the dog would rise and settle just near enough that she could hear his breathing. Not touching, just near, just steady, like an anchor, like a heartbeat. She never named the grief either. But it was there, like the dog, refusing to leave. It happened just after dawn, on a morning that felt like any other. Ruth had woken early, the way she always did, drawn from shallow sleep by the familiar ache in her chest and the weight of a silence that had become routine. She moved through her chores with a practiced stillness, stoking the stove, brushing off the porch, fetching water from the well. The dog, ever silent and steady, followed her at a distance, paws soft on the dirt, eyes watchful. It wasn't until she turned to head back from the well that she noticed something different. The dog had stopped near the edge of the fence line. He stood still, alert, tail low but unmoving. Ruth squinted toward him, confused by his stance. He wasn't barking, not growling, just watching. Then he looked back at her. And that was when she saw it. A shape, small, slumped, just beyond the fence under the shadow of the oak tree. For a moment, her mind resisted what her eyes were telling her. She thought perhaps it was a bundle of rags, or maybe some animal curled in sleep. But the stillness was too human, too fragile. Her heart jumped in her chest. Ruth dropped the pail and walked quickly toward the fence, her boots crunching dry grass, breath catching in her throat. As she drew closer, the shape became clearer, a child. A little girl, no older than 2, bundled tightly in a tattered, dirt-smudged blanket. Her cheeks were streaked with dried tears and dust. Her lips were dry, cracked from cold or thirst or both. But she was breathing, chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. Ruth dropped to her knees in the grass, hands trembling. The dog stood just beside the child, not touching her, but clearly guarding. His eyes never left Ruth's face. "Dear God," Ruth whispered, though the words felt strange in her mouth after so many weeks of silence. "Where did you come from?" The child didn't stir. Ruth looked around quickly, toward the woods, the road, the distant hills, but saw no movement. No figure waiting, no wagon tracks or boot prints in the dirt. Whoever had left the child hadn't intended to be seen, and hadn't intended to return. A knot formed in Ruth's throat. Her fingers reached out, brushing the child's cheek. It was cold, not dangerously so, but enough to make her move fast. She slipped her arms beneath the girl and lifted her gently. The child didn't resist. She didn't even open her eyes, only shifted slightly, head turning just enough to rest against Ruth's chest. Ruth stood slowly, blanket and child held tight against her body. The girl was so light, too light, her bones pressed through her skin like twigs. And the way she leaned into Ruth's warmth broke something inside the woman she hadn't known still could break. She moved without thinking, crossed the fence, back through the yard, up the porch steps. The dog trotted behind her silently, as if he knew this was always meant to happen. The quilt, the one Ruth had once made in hope, then hidden in sorrow, was still airing on the porch rail. She snatched it as she passed, wrapped the child inside, cradling her like glass. Inside the house, she laid the girl near the hearth and lit the stove with shaking hands. Water boiled, apples were crushed, milk was warmed with care. Ruth moved as if in a trance, but her heart was racing, her mind whirling. Who could abandon a child like this? She'd known hunger, she'd known loss, but to place a baby, barely more than a toddler, at the edge of someone else's land and walk away? It was something else entirely. It wasn't desperation, it was surrender, it was fear. The girl blinked, slowly, eyes heavy but alert. She watched Ruth move around the kitchen with cautious curiosity. Not crying, not smiling, just observing. Ruth knelt beside her with a spoonful of mashed apple. "Here," she said softly, "let's start with this." The child's lips parted. She accepted the food with quiet instinct, chewing slowly, never breaking eye contact. Ruth studied her as she ate. She had soft brown hair, tangled and full of straw. Her skin was fair beneath the dirt, and her eyes, hazel, deep, filled with something old, watched the world like someone already familiar with loss. "You're too young to know that look," Ruth whispered. The child reached for Ruth's hand. Later that evening, After the girl had fallen asleep curled into the quilt by the fire, Ruth sat in her rocking chair, staring into the flickering light. She couldn't stop looking at the child. The fragile rise and fall of her chest. The way her small hand clutched the edge of the blanket, as if it were a lifeline. She didn't know what to call her. Names had weight. Names meant something permanent. Ruth had once given a name to a daughter who never took her first breath. That name still haunted her. But this child was different. She had survived something. She had been left. And yet, she had made it to Ruth's fence. To Ruth's home. That meant something. And then, as if from nowhere, the word came. Clover. Ruth spoke it aloud, quietly, testing it. Not Daisy, not Rose, but Clover. A small, stubborn green thing that grew in the cracks. In the dirt. In the places forgotten by flowers. Something that didn't ask for much, but survived even the frost. She looked down at the child. Still sleeping. Yes, she murmured. That's what you are. Outside, the dog stirred on the porch, lifting his head. Ruth didn't move from her chair. She sat there, Clover breathing steadily beside her, and felt, for the first time in a long time, something like purpose begin to stir. She didn't know who had left the girl. She didn't know why, but she knew one thing with certainty. Clover had been chosen by the wind, by fate, by silence itself, and Ruth had answered. It began with something small. One morning, as Ruth stepped onto the porch, her breath caught in her throat. The food bowl, the one she kept near the top step for the dog, had been moved. Not dragged randomly like before, but carefully placed at the foot of the stairs. Next to it, with surprising delicacy, sat a wooden horse. It was small, roughly carved, old, its edges worn smooth from touch. A simple thing, and yet, unmistakably crafted with care. Ruth froze, heart skipping once, then thudding louder. The horse looked almost identical to the one Clover now kept close by her side, the same that had once belonged to Ruth and Nathaniel's dream of a family. But this one was different. On its underside, she found a mark, a shallow carving of waves, no of a sea. The lines weren't accidental. Someone had etched them there deliberately. She scanned the yard, the woods, the road. Nothing. The dog stood at her side, watching too, ears alert. No movement, no footsteps, no sound beyond the wind in the grass. Still, she felt it. Someone had been here. Inside, Clover was napping, the other wooden horse still clutched tightly in her small hand. Ruth stared at both toys, nearly twins, and her stomach twisted. Coincidence didn't live in places like this. That night, she sat by the fire. Not working, not reading, just watching the flames. The silence, once suffocating, now pulsed with questions. Who had left the carving? Why did it look so familiar? And why had her heart dropped when she saw it? She barely slept. The next morning, she found the second sign. A handkerchief, folded neatly, placed on the porch rail, knotted tightly around something solid. Ruth hesitated before opening it, fingers trembling. Inside was a ring, child-sized, silver, with a dull green stone set into the center. Her breath left her chest in a rush. It was almost identical to the one Nathaniel had given her before their wedding. The one buried with their stillborn daughter. She turned it over. Inside the band, 3 letters were faintly etched, CLN. The initials didn't match Ruth's. They didn't match Nathaniel's, but the N at the end lit a slow, searing fuse in her memory. Her mind raced through possibilities. Could it be a sibling? A stranger? Or someone else entirely? She didn't speak for the rest of the day, only moved through her tasks in a fog of unease and thought. Clover, oblivious, danced through the garden, trailing the dog as if she had always belonged. Ruth couldn't bear to tell her. But by the time dusk came, she was watching the tree line again. 2 days passed without incident. But the air around the cabin felt different now, heavier. Not dangerous, just watched. Ruth began to notice small things. The sound of brush cracking softly in the woods. The dog stiffening at certain moments, then relaxing as if sensing something familiar. The way Clover turned her head, curious, whenever the wind changed direction. And then came the letter. She hadn't checked the mailbox in months. It sat at the end of the dusty road, unused and forgotten. But something, instinct or perhaps desperation, pulled her toward it that morning. Inside, nestled among cobwebs and old leaves, was a single folded page. No envelope, no stamp, just her name in handwriting she didn't recognize, yet somehow did. Her hands shook as she opened it. You have her. I won't take her. But I need you to know why she was left. Not to abandon, never that. To protect. They were going to sell her. Ruth, I paid what I could and ran. She's safe because of you. Let me keep her safe too. From afar, Ruth stared at the words until they blurred. She read them again, and again. Her legs went weak. She sat in the dust. The letter clenched in her hand. Wind tugging at her sleeves like the whisper of a ghost. It couldn't be Nathaniel. He was gone. She'd buried him, touched his cold hands, laid the earth over him herself. But the way the letter was written, the weight behind the words, it felt too familiar, too personal. Inside the cabin, Clover laughed, chasing the dog in a circle. Ruth stood slowly, watching them through the open door. That night, she left bread and jerky on the porch, not as a gift, but as a message. I know you're out there. By dawn, the food was gone. In its place was something new. A photograph. Faded, torn at one corner. It showed a Lakota woman with long braids standing beside a white man Ruth had never seen. But the child in the woman's arms, barely a toddler, had eyes Ruth recognized immediately. Clover's. The photo slipped from Ruth's fingers. She sat down on the porch steps, heart pounding, the image trembling in her lap. Questions circled her like vultures. Why had the man not come forward? Why only gifts, tokens, breadcrumbs? Was he ashamed? Was he hiding from something, or someone? Clover wandered out, barefoot and bright-eyed, and nestled herself beside Ruth. She leaned gently against her side, pressing the carved horse into Ruth's lap. Mama, she whispered. It wasn't the first time. But it was the first time Ruth felt the words settle into her chest like a seed that had finally found earth. She looked toward the woods. Letter still crumpled in her hand. Somewhere out there, someone was watching, not to steal, not to threaten, but to repent, to guard what he'd once been forced to leave behind, to ask, silently, for a place close enough to protect, far enough not to disrupt. And Ruth, torn between fear and wonder, whispered into the wind, I see you, but I will not let her go. It was past noon when the knock came, sharp, deliberate, not like the wind, not like the soft scrape of the dog's paw at the door. Ruth froze mid-motion. The kitchen knife halted halfway through a potato. Her fingers gripped the handle so tightly they ached. She hadn't heard hooves, hadn't seen dust on the road. But someone was there. She could feel it, the kind of stillness that presses on your ribs from the inside. The knock came again. She wiped her hands, moved slowly, heart thudding like it had forgotten how to keep calm. When she opened the door, the light outside spilled over the wooden floor. And there he stood, not old, not young, hair dark and tied back, a rawhide jacket clinging to his frame, dusted with travel. His face wasn't familiar, but his eyes were. They were Clover's eyes, the shape, the depth, the quiet way they watched. He held nothing in his hands. No bag, no gift, just open palms, as if to say, I came with nothing to take. I'm not here to claim her, he said quietly, his voice cracked, raw and weathered like bark in winter. I just needed to see her. Just once. Ruth didn't speak, couldn't. Her body stood between him and the threshold. But Clover, curious and gentle, had already toddled to the doorway. She held her carved horse in one hand, the wooden figure of the mother in the other. She looked up at the man with those knowing eyes, blinked once, then reached out a tiny hand and touched his leg. You came, she whispered. The man dropped to his knees. His hands didn't reach for her. His arms didn't move. He only wept, silently. Tears sliding down his cheeks as if they had been waiting years for permission. Yes, little leaf, he choked. I came late, but I came. Ruth watched, her throat tight with something jagged and unfamiliar. Anger? No, not quite. Not grief either. Something more complicated. She should have closed the door. Should have asked him to leave. Should have demanded answers. But Clover had already climbed into his lap like it was the safest place on earth. And he hadn't flinched. She remembers the carvings, Ruth said finally, her voice low. She remembers the song you left on the wind. He looked up at her, eyes shimmering. I was a coward. He admitted, I paid everything I had to keep her from being sold. I ran, but I didn't think I had the right to come back. Ruth stepped outside, arms folded, the weight of winter and memory pressing into her spine. You don't have the right, she said bluntly. She chose who to call Mama. That wasn't your doing. He nodded. I'm not here to change that. Then why are you here? He looked toward the barn. To build a fence, he said. To plant corn. To stay close enough in case the wind turns cruel again. She didn't answer right away. The air between them filled with the sound of birds and Clover's soft breathing. Her mind raced. Who was he to think he could just return? To linger near like a ghost that never settled? And yet, he hadn't demanded a place. He hadn't pushed for a title. He had only asked to work. By the end of that day, Ruth allowed him to stay on the land, but only during the day. No nights, no sleeping under her roof, no promises, just labor. He never argued. Each morning, he returned, tools in hand. He didn't ask for meals, didn't speak unless spoken to. He built the fence slowly, carefully, setting each post deep, tying beams with thick twine, as if he believed the work itself was sacred. Ruth watched him from the porch with Clover on her hip, unsure whether to feel safer or more exposed. Part of her wanted to trust him. Another part still curled around her grief like a wounded animal. She had lost too much to give anything freely again. But he never crossed the line. He sang while he worked, soft whistles. Old Lakota melodies with no words. Clover hummed them in her sleep. The dog stayed near him too, always between Ruth's cabin and the tree line, as if silently judging whether the man belonged. One evening, Ruth brought him a tin of rabbit stew and fresh bread. He didn't say thank you with words, just nodded, sat on a stump, and ate slowly, eyes fixed on the earth. When he finished, he wiped his mouth and asked, Did she speak to you, before I came? Ruth nodded, little bits, not full sentences, but she always called me Mama. From the first week, he smiled faintly, and for the first time, the pain beneath his expression felt quiet. She had a sister, he said, didn't make it through that winter. I buried them both once, her, and the life I thought I'd have. Ruth sat beside him on the ground. The dirt was cool against her skirt. You buried grief, she said, but not love. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. He reached into his coat, pulled out a carving, a woman holding two children. One stood tall, the other perched on her hip. This one's not for Clover, he said. It's for you. Ruth took it gently. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, honest. A mirror of what might still become whole. She looked at him then, truly looked, not as the man who had once disappeared, but as someone trying to stay. A man who carried his mistakes on his back like firewood, and who was willing to rebuild not with apology, but with action. She's not the only one learning how to belong, she whispered. He nodded, quiet. I don't need to be forgiven, he said, only allowed to try. And somehow, that felt enough, for now. The morning Clover first called him Papa. The sky was still a sleepy lavender, the air cool with dew. Ruth had just begun to stir the fire when she felt a tug on her skirt. He's here, Clover whispered, eyes heavy with sleep. Ruth didn't question how she knew. Clover had a way of sensing things, storms, sorrow, strangers, and now, him. She wrapped the child in her shawl and stepped out onto the porch. And there he was, crouched near the barn, tightening a hinge no one had asked him to fix. The dog sat nearby, as always, watching but not warning. The man looked up and smiled, his face softer in the golden light of dawn. Before Ruth could call out, Clover wriggled free, ran barefoot across the wet grass, and simply said, Papa, not loud, not hesitant, just certain. The tool fell from his hand. For a full breath, he didn't move. Then he dropped to his knees in the dirt and opened his arms. Clover crashed into them with the full weight of a child's love, simple, fierce, and unquestioning. Ruth stood still, one hand pressed to her chest, as something inside her cracked open. Not broken, just released. A wound finally given air. He didn't look at Ruth. He simply held Clover like she was the most sacred thing in the world. As if he'd been waiting all his life to be chosen again. Later that morning, they ate corn cakes and honey on the porch. Clover's laughter filled the air, sticky fingers and all. The dog chased grasshoppers through the yard while birds called down from the trees like witnesses to something holy. He turned to Ruth then, quietly, almost nervously. "I have no tribe anymore," he said, voice low but steady. "But I have her. And if you'll let me, I'd like to build more than fences here. I'd like to build whatever she needs. Whatever you need." Ruth looked down at her hands that had buried a husband, held a dying child, and stitched her grief into a quilt of stars. She thought of the years this house had been nothing but a tomb. A monument to what might have been. Now there was laughter again. Warmth in the walls. Life in the garden. "You'll never have to earn her love," she said finally, her voice soft but sure. "You gave her life twice. But mine, you'll have to be patient with that." He nodded, no pride in his face. "Only gratitude." "I can wait," he said. "I've waited this long." Ruth reached out and placed her hand over his. "Then let's start by planting that corn you talked about. Maybe some wildflowers too. She likes those." The days that followed felt different. Lighter. Clover sang as she played, making up nonsense songs for her carved animals. The dog kept watch, though more relaxed now, as if he knew the burden had shifted. Shared. Ruth found herself smiling without realizing it, humming while hanging laundry, leaving the door ajar, not in fear, but in welcome. The man, Clover's father, continued to work. He repaired the shed, mended the garden fence, and carved more figures for Clover, a bear, a hawk, a dancing woman with a braid down her back. Each carving was left on the porch bench like a quiet offering. He never moved into the house. He slept somewhere in the woods, always returning at dawn with fresh wood, new seeds, stories hidden in his eyes. Ruth didn't press. He'd speak when he was ready. One evening, just before supper, he handed her a final carving. This one was different. A woman holding two children, one standing tall, the other perched on her hip. "This one's not for Clover," he said. "It's for you." Ruth traced the grooves with her fingers, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't perfect. The lines were uneven, the figures small, but it was real. It was honest. It was theirs. She placed it on the mantel that night, next to the photograph of Nathaniel and the baby quilt that still smelled of cedar and hope. And for the first time, the cabin no longer felt like a place patched together from loss. It felt like home. Clover's world began to bloom. She learned to say thank you and more please and why is the sky blue? She learned to plant beans and count stars and laugh with her whole body. She rode the dog like a pony. She handed out names to everything, the chickens, the rocks, even the wind. And when storms rolled in from the west, she curled against Ruth's side without fear, whispering, "Papa will come back after the rain." He always did. Sometimes, Ruth would find him standing at the edge of the field after dusk, hands in his pockets, watching the house. He never came inside without invitation, but he always stayed close enough to return if needed. It wasn't a conventional family. There were no wedding rings, no promises sealed in paper, just shared labor, shared silence, shared love, and slowly, Ruth let herself believe in it. Not in a fairy tale, not in perfection, but in second chances, in rebuilding something with hands calloused by grief and hearts willing to try again. One evening, as the sun melted behind the ridge, Clover placed her two carved horses on the porch rail. "Which one's Mama?" she asked. Ruth pointed to the smaller one with stars etched into its side. "And which one's Papa?" Clover smiled, pointing to the sturdier one with carved waves. "That one. He came late," she said matter-of-factly. "But he stayed." Ruth reached for her hand, kissed the top of her head. "Yes," she whispered, "and so did we." The wind rustled the corn in the garden. The sky deepened into a soft indigo. And somewhere, a mourning dove called from the trees, not in sadness, but in recognition. The world wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And that, Ruth had learned, was enough.